Before starting, we would like to thank Peter Easton for the opportunity to present this paper. My name is Maria Correia, and I'm at the London School of Economics, and this is joint work with Stefano Cascino, also at the London School of Economics. And in this paper, we examine the effect of the staggered rollout of ESG disclosure mandates in business group headquarters countries on the ESG performance of parent and subsidiary firms. Regulators often use transparency as a policy tool to address environmental and social externalities, and this is seen as a less intrusive and more politically expedient tool than other regulatory interventions, such as cap and control. The idea is that sunlight is the best disinfectant. So several countries have implemented ESG disclosure mandates, and these mandates have been shown to affect ESG performance through three main channels. Internal learning, the idea that firms now have to collect and process more information, and in the process of doing so, they may identify areas for improvement. Stakeholder pressure, investors, consumers, suppliers now have access to more information and may pressure the firm to improve its ESG performance. And peer benchmarking, with firms wanting to perform at least as well as their peers. So consistent with these mechanisms, Fichter et al., for example, find that the ESG performance of firms improves following the adoption of the European Union non-financial reporting directives. In this paper, we're going to examine the impact of ESG disclosure mandates on the ESG performance of business groups. And we think this is interesting and important for multiple reasons. First, business groups are responsible for a large fraction of the world GDP and also a large fraction of the world's carbon emissions. And they can either conform with regulatory expectations, but they can also have the ability to obstruct and actively resist change. Specifically, they can take advantage of their organizational structure to shift irresponsible ESG activities to subsidiaries where they're less likely to be detected and scrutinized. And this process is called regulatory arbitrage. There are several examples of ESG responsible activities taking place at subsidiary rather than parent level. For example, in the Deepwater Oil Horizon scandal, this relates to a spill and an explosion taking place at Transocean, a subsidiary of BP. And another recent example involves Konkola Copper Mines in Zambia. This is a subsidiary of a UK company called Vedanta. And they were caught and they were accused of a toxic discharge into the river that was used for irrigation and for drinking by Zambian farmers, who actually brought the parent company, Vedanta, to court, to UK court. Now, these ESG disclosure mandates require firms to produce and disclose information on policies, risks, and outcomes related to ESG. And this could either be in their annual reports or in separate sustainability reports. These mandates are typically issued by government bodies, but they can also be issued by financial market regulators and stock exchanges. They primarily apply to public firms, which is something that we take advantage of in our research design, and they typically follow an enterprise approach. What this means is that they look at the group as a single economic entity. And this is in contrast to other regulatory interventions that tend to focus at the individual entity level. So our main question is, do business groups arbitrage ESG disclosure mandates? We argue that the ESG mandates can increase the costs of irresponsible ESG activities. Specifically, it can increase local costs for parents and subsidiaries, and this can include monitoring and reporting costs, the costs associated with increased visibility of irresponsible ESG activities to stakeholders as well. In addition to these local costs, we argue that the ESG disclosure mandates can increase spillover costs. This would be costs for parents associated with subsidiaries' irresponsible ESG activities. And this could be, for example, legal costs, namely costs associated with veil piercing. And veil piercing is a judicially imposed exception to limited liability, whereby parent companies can be held legally responsible for torts at the subsidiary level beyond their level of investment in the subsidiary, and also reputational costs. Now, we expect the marginal cost of conducting ESG irresponsible activities at the parent level to increase more than the marginal cost of conducting irresponsible ESG activities at the subsidiary level. And this is for multiple reasons. First, parent companies can be shielded from reputational damage or legal liability because they are insulated through very complex corporate control chains that make it hard to link the subsidiary to the parent company. Second, there is often home bias, where investors are more likely to punish firms for misbehavior that takes place locally rather than in foreign countries. The quality of ESG information at the subsidiary level is often low, and this could lead to poor group-wide ESG disclosures. And there is also a lower likelihood of detection and lower reputation and legal penalties in countries that have weaker institutional oversight or that have weaker social norms when it comes to the environment. So we expect that once these ESG disclosure mandates become effective, in the country of the headquarters of the business group, there will be a higher allocation of irresponsible ESG activities to subsidiaries. How do we do this? We take advantage of the data in Orbis Historical, which allows us to reconstruct business groups with detailed data on parent and subsidiary companies, and we obtain ESG incidents from RepRisk. So let's suppose that we have two groups. One is headquartered in the UK. The UK passed an ESG disclosure mandate during our sample period. So this would be our treated group. And let's suppose we have another group in whose parent company is headquartered in the US. And the US did not pass an ESG disclosure mandate during our sample period. What we're essentially going to do is to compare the performance of the subsidiaries of the treated and control groups. Specifically, let's assume that both groups have a subsidiary in Zambia. And we're essentially going to look at the change in the number of ESG incidents of the Zambian subsidiary of the British parents before and after the ESG disclosure mandate, using the Zambian subsidiary of the US parent as a control. What do we find? We document a statistically significant and also economically significant increase in both the occurrence and the number of subsidiary ESG incidents once the mandate becomes effective at the headquarter country. Specifically, there is an increase in 16% in the occurrence of subsidiary incidents. We also look at the number of incidents at the parent level. And here we find that there is a decline in the occurrence and the number of ESG incidents at the parent entity level. And this is consistent with a shift in the number of incidents from the parents to the subsidiary. So this is consistent with regulatory arbitrage. We then look at the group as a whole, where essentially we add the number of ESG incidents for all the subsidiaries in the group, as well as for the parent company. So in this case, we would be comparing the total number of incidents in the UK group with the change in the total number of incidents in the US group. And we document a decline in the number of incidents in the treated groups. And this is consistent with the ESG performance of groups improving following the adoption of ESG disclosure mandate, despite some incidents being shifted to subsidiaries. Now, one could ask whether this is economically significant or consequential, and we find evidence that that's the case. Specifically, we look at whether the number of severe ESG incidents increases, and we find evidence consistent with this. So now I'm going to pass on to Stefano, who is going to continue talking about our empirical analysis.
Thank you very much, Maria. So the next question that we're going to examine now is, why do business groups arbitrage ESG disclosure mandates? And one could think that the parent companies may take costly actions to ameliorate their ESG performance. For example, they could pursue investments in green technology, they can improve their overall level of compliance, or they can start and initiate a CSR committee. However, such improvements may be unfeasible or outright expensive for financially constrained business groups, so business groups that face high financial constraints. For this reason, what we are going to hypothesize is that financially constrained business groups are more likely to engage in regulatory arbitrage. And that's exactly what we find in our empirical data. We find that only business groups that are financially constrained experience in their subsidiaries both an increase in the occurrence as well as an increase in the frequency of ESG incidents. Having examined the why, we then move to the where do business groups shift their irresponsible ESG activities. And to answer this question, we're going to conduct a number of cross-sectional tests. What's the idea here? The idea is that after an ESG disclosure mandate gets enacted in the parent country, essentially what happens is that there is a reshuffling in the pecking order of the marginal cost of conducting irresponsible ESG activities across subsidiaries. And therefore, what we contend is that the position of the subsidiary in the value chain matters. For example, retail subsidiaries, that are those that are closer to the final consumers, are more exposed to visibility, right? If consumers get to have more information as a result of these ESG disclosure mandates, basically outrage would be a likely outcome. And so what we contend here, what we posit is that this regulatory arbitrage, so the shifting of irresponsible ESG actions, is more likely to materialize in manufacturing as opposed to retail subsidiaries. We're also going to check whether enforcement matters. What we hypothesize is that this regulatory arbitrage is going to be more prominent where enforcement is lax. So in subsidiaries located in countries where, for example, the rule of law is weak, and so is the government effectiveness. Also, business groups are going to relocate irresponsible ESG actions in countries with weak social norms regarding environmental issues, or where barriers to NGO activities are high. So, for example, in countries where activism is somewhat limited by law. And lastly, we're going to check if the extent to which business groups engage in regulatory arbitrage is associated with the degree of veil piercing. Now, on to the results. What we find is pretty much in line with our hypothesis. We do find that regulatory arbitrage clusters more in manufacturing subsidiaries, so subsidiaries that belong to industries that are shielded from the eyes of consumers. We also find that regulatory arbitrage seems to be more pronounced in subsidiary countries with weak rule of law, with the low level of government effectiveness, where the environmental performance index of the subsidiary country is especially low, where NGO barriers are high, and where the risk of veil piercing is low. This is true both for the number of incidents where we experience a relative increase, as well as for the occurrence of these incidents. Now, next question we're going to examine is how do business groups shift their irresponsible ESG activities? And the economic mechanism that we have in mind is that parent firms, once they experience the adoption of an ESG disclosure mandate in their home country, they're going to utilize more both their physical capital as well as their human capital. And so what we are going to in their subsidiaries. And so what we are going to contend here is that asset utilization in subsidiaries should go up as well as employee utilization. And that's what we find in the data. And these effects are even more pronounced if the business groups are financially constrained. The results that we have documented so far speak to an intensive margin effect. effect, meaning that in response to the adoption of an ESG disclosure mandate, basically business groups reshuffle their ESG activities within their corporate structure. But we also look at an extensive margin effect. So what happens beyond the boundaries of the business groups? And what we find is that if the additional combined local subsidiary and spillover costs that result from the ESG disclosure mandate exceeds the benefits of owning a subsidiary, then the optimal response should be to divest from that subsidiary. And so we're going to check whether, in response to ESG disclosure mandates, those subsidiaries that are ESG risky, so that they pose high ESG risks ex ante, and that are non-synergistic to the business group, meaning that they don't bring benefit to the business group, are those that are actually divested. And that's exactly what we find. We find that in response to the adoption of an ESG disclosure mandate, non-synergistic subsidiaries and subsidiaries that pose ESG risk are both partially divested in the 3 years following the ESG disclosure mandate. And when the costs that these subsidiaries impose are particularly high, they get fully divested, meaning that the parent company reduces the ownership of those subsidiaries to zero. And so in conclusion, what we document in this paper is that the business group parents do improve their ESG performance, their individual ESG performance following the adoption of an ESG disclosure mandate. However, they do so in part by reshuffling irresponsible ESG activities to their subsidiaries. We term this finding a regulatory arbitrage, because basically companies are exploiting their geographic footprints among different countries. This regulatory arbitrage is more pronounced among business groups that are financially constrained. Parent firms of business groups actively exploit cross-country variation in institutional quality, and so regulatory arbitrage happens in subsidiary countries with weak rule of law, weak government effectiveness, and so on. The reallocation occurs through an increase in the use of subsidiaries' existing productive capacity. And we believe that our findings are very important because they underscore the importance of enforcing an enterprise approach to ESG disclosure regulation, and they also highlight the costs of uneven regulation. Thank you.